Hi, I'm Laura Fisher, archivist here at the Petersen Automotive Museum. Today I'm excited to share with you some very special artifacts from our collection revolving around World War II. Now, historians have dedicated their entire careers to understanding the world wars, especially World War II, and the effects it had on society, not just here in America, but internationally. Today I'm just going to focus on the artifacts we have available to tell that story. America wouldn't enter World War II until December 11th, 1941, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. By 1942, the effects of World War II on the home front were starting to be felt in many different ways, from social and economic changes such as changing gender roles and a rebound of the economy after the Great Depression of the 1930s, to even the targeting of Japanese Americans who were interned in Japanese internment camps on American soil. So I want you to keep all of that in mind as we discuss just a few ways that the home front was affected by World War II. Of course, I'm going to be working with a lot of different artifacts, so I have to put on everyone's favorite prop, which is my gloves. I'm excited to share these artifacts with you today because I know some of our audience is going to recognize some of them. And that's what makes history exciting for me, is that you can make history relevant and personal, and that's what makes it so very special and educational. So first we're going to start out with some of my favorite artifacts in our entire collection. These are just phenomenal moments in history that are captured, and these are World War II ration books. So I first have ration book holders. This one's a little worse for wear, but we do have one that was repaired, and you can see someone's name in it. And then this one has a neat detail. It has a little calendar on the back for 1944 and 1945. And I do have the actual ration books. We actually have quite a few, which is interesting to me. This is a small stack of the different ones that we have, but I'm going to give you details of the 4 that we do have. So the first one, which was issued in early 1942 when rationing began, looks a little like this. And what you might note is that as we go through these, is that the style and stamp system did change throughout the war. Now, they had to get ration books out quickly, so this was the first design. We still have a few ration stamps left in this book. Oh, and a few left in that book as well. And that one. That tells me actually they're all 3 the same. That tells me that those ration stamps were never used. That leads me to our next set of ration books, which actually helps explain this anomaly a little bit better. So here we have set 2, issued a little later in 1942, and then we have set 3. And you will notice, if you've ever looked at these before, and there's a lot of examples online too that are digitized if you ever want to research them, I'll link them below. But you can see that the stamps have just generic numbers and images on them. And that is because the local newspaper would often issue from the rationing board what the different stamps could be used for at any different time. And so these may never have been used for any specific object because the rationing board just didn't get around to it, or they didn't have parameters for it, or perhaps they issued another ration book later. Now they would issue, say, like stamp 20 was good for this, such as flour and sugar, or this stamp was good for shoes because rubber was also rationed. And so it was often a bit of a roller coaster to understand what would be available week to week, month to month. And they did this specifically because they knew that resources were going to change throughout the war. Some weeks you'd have more sugar, then you'd have coffee. Some weeks you'd have more flour, then you'd have rubber. And that was really concerning to home front citizens. They were encouraged actually to not take too much, to not buy what they didn't need, but also to use up everything and recycle things as needed. You'll often see that there are warnings on ration books to recycle tin for the war effort. And there were even items like toothpaste that came in metal cans that you would actually have to exchange your used up metal tube in order to acquire a new one, to make sure that there was no new metal being used to produce these objects. So many things are rationed during the war: flour, sugar, gasoline, rubber, medicines. Most concerning to me was coffee. So, just a home front tragedy if I ever saw one. While rationing on the home front was difficult for every household, people did willingly participate. There were some black market activities regarding ration books and stamps. It's important to note that rationing got more intense as the war went on. With book number 2, actually, things like butter, margarine, meat, fish, and other kinds of fat were beginning to be rationed, and even canned fruits and vegetables. When book 2 was issued, each household was actually required to create an inventory of what they already had, and those stamps were actually removed from their ration stamp book. This was intended to equalize the resources across the country and prevent hoarding and aftermarket price gouging. Now you might be wondering what exactly rationing has to do with automotive history. Well, in wartime, pretty much everything. Actually, all car manufacturing completely halted in 1942, with most of the American manufacturing plants being diverted to make things like bombers or jeeps and other military vehicles. For everyday citizens, that meant that they couldn't buy new cars during the war, and that things like gasoline were rationed. Now, I'm going to share with you some gasoline and mileage ration coupons that are very interesting. Here we have some window stickers and coupons and a non-highway ration. So I'll explain all of these. So these were window stickers based on the necessity of the gas that you had to use. So B was for businesses or some military activities. T was for truck drivers, and to accompany these were actually the ration coupons. So this is important to know. As with the ration books, you needed also not just the ration coupons, but the money to buy it. So you still had to pay full price for the object in addition to having the proper rationing coupons based on which coupons were good that week. The amount of gas was actually rationed in units. The units actually based on your class would change week to week, again due to war conditions constantly changing. And then you also had things like non-highway rations. These are interesting. These were usually used for industrial machines that required gasoline, other kinds of fuel, stoves, farming, and things like that. To accompany that, we have also another kind of certificate, and this is a certificate of war necessity, and this was something that you would apply for based on your business need. It says it's for a commercial vehicle fleet unit, and this is basically if you had to prove that you have been cleared by the ration board to have that vehicle and run it during the war, this was your proof. Almost like your car registration of some kind. And then something interesting that I think our race fans would like to learn more about is the fact that racing, because it used gasoline, was completely banned in the US. Not only did it waste gasoline, it wasted rubber because of tire use, and these rations actually affected everyday people too. So things like leisure driving were completely banned, and there was a national speed limit of 35 instituted in order to save not only gas, but wear and tear on the tires. And actually historians have studied the effects that this had on the tire usage, and it turns out it had a huge effect on wear and tear and tire recycling rates. So that's pretty interesting, that it actually did work and it helped the war effort quite a bit. What I have here is an auto racing album. And so usually, as all my race fans will know, that you would have racing programs produced almost every week for a race, but with no races, there's no racing programs. And so race fans had to get their fix somewhere else. You'll notice that there is an advertisement to buy war bonds. Very common to see on almost all advertising in the US was encouraging the public to buy war bonds. And I'll show you a few more war bond type advertisements in just a minute. But you'll see the very patriotic artwork. And what this was basically just a photo album of racing highlights so race fans could get their fix while they couldn't go to an actual race. It's full of quite a bit of photos, but these probably weren't published too often because paper was also rationed. You'll notice that here on the forward, They talk about how racing has been suspended, and that's why this is being published. So you'll find on a lot of wartime publications like this that they'll have a little message about that and a message about them supporting the war effort. So next I have, as promised, some advertisements from World War II. These are always fun to look at, mostly because, again, they capture a moment in time. Now, as I mentioned, a lot of manufacturers were diverted to building military vehicles for the war effort, and many of my off-road fans will know that, of course, the Jeep has a very important part in World War II history. Here you have the Ford manufactured Jeep featured on an advertisement, and then of course we have some Dodge trucks and other military vehicles. Car manufacturers often like to advertise that they supported the war effort. And here you have another little, and almost every advertisement from this era had little emblems encouraging buying war bonds. Now, war bonds were an important part of funding World War II. A citizen would buy a war bond for, say, $75, which it actually had a face value of $100. And the promise was that the government would repay that $100 face value with interest after the war. So it was considered a patriotic act to buy a war bond that would pay off later. Now, I quite love this Jeep advertisement. So just because you're not making cars doesn't mean that you don't want people to forget that you're a company. So many car companies like Dodge, Ford, Fisher, they would advertise incessantly the kind of vehicles they're making for the war effort. You'll notice that this Jeep illustration also has an amphibian Jeep advertisement. I find this one interesting because the wording talks about the amphibian Jeep as if they're using it a lot on all of the theaters of World War II, when in reality, soldiers found the amphibian Jeep very cumbersome, have had terrible water ability, pretty much the worst landability as they were slow and huge and very heavy. But Ford wanted to advertise this advancement in technology anyway. I have one more over here. I like this one because it demonstrates how many arenas General Motors was manufacturing in, because you have everything from planes and engines when they worked with Pratt Whitney, artillery, and other military vehicles. We're working together to win this war, and so I think that a lot of those patriotic slogans that you're always hearing around World War II actually came from a lot of this advertising. Now, I have kind of a fun artifact for you all, and it's kind of weird. But it's another example of rationing. So I mentioned metal rationing was very common. That included license plates, right? That's a lot of metal. So, especially in the Midwest, they came up with a bit of an alternative. They made fiberboard out of soybeans. So this is actually a license plate from Virginia made in 1944, and it is soybean fiberboard. I'll try to show the detail here. It's made exactly how fiberboard is made today, just heat and pressure applied to different layers of glue and soy fiber to create this bonded plate. It's holding up okay, but when I was doing research for this episode, I did come across a ton, and when I say a ton, more than a few, newspaper articles describing people complaining that turkeys, dogs, and even pigs were actually devouring and eating the license plates right off of cars. So talk about hometown problems. I had a little bit of a laugh about that. One more example though of wartime rationing, and this is actually my favorite artifact. I'm a little biased. I love books and I love trains, what can I say? But this is a book called Railroads at War, and it was published during the war, and actually just like the racing program we showed, and most books published during the war will have something like this. It basically has a notice saying that you'll notice there are more words on the pages, less paper, but that doesn't mean they cut any of the text from the book out. And so it's just reassuring the consumer that they're getting a good product. You'll notice the paper's pretty thin. And yes, they did use pretty small font. Book manufacturers and publishers were having a bit of a problem during World War II. The issue was that since a lot of leisure activities were halted or rationed, like you couldn't drive anywhere, you couldn't get as much food or go out to restaurants as often, people actually took to reading more. And people were very interested actually in books about war and philosophy and poetry. So book manufacturers actually had an increase in demand, but they were being throttled by ration parameters. And so they had to decide which titles they were going to publish, which ones they were going to republish that were more popular, but they had to do it with less paper. The first year that book publishers were rationed with paper, they actually only had to decrease their paper usage by about 10% from their 1941 usage. Each year throughout the war, however, that would increase to an eventual 35%. And so you'll notice that this one is actually published in 1944, so it was probably published under the most strict rationing guidelines that publishers were under. I did notice something last night when I was looking at this book preparing for this video. I just noticed it, and I didn't get a chance to really confirm, so don't quote me on this, but I noticed there's a little defect in the cutting of the book, and it's a little tag that comes out on one of the text pages. And that happens sometimes in cheaper book publishing, mass market, paperbacks and whatnot. But what I can probably guess is that things like metal, of course, were still being rationed. And so the blade that was used to cut this was probably not as sharp as it should have been, or a little older than it should have been, over sharpened a few too many times. In addition, the paper is much thinner, so it had more give and probably folded under the blade. And so you get little kind of defects like that. And I just love when objects kind of tell you a story in a different language and give up their history a little bit like that. You just have to know where to look for things like that. Eventually, we would end World War II in 1945. The events leading up to the end, of course, were the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs, the first one on August 6, 1945 on Hiroshima, and the second one on August 9, 1945 on Nagasaki. This would lead to the Japanese surrender on August 15, 1945, which effectively ended the war and wartime rationing. But it's interesting to note that things like sugar were actually still rationed until 1947. So coming back from the effects of World War II on the home front didn't happen overnight. I love reflecting on artifacts like this because they really demonstrate how things were for everyday people like you and me during a moment in history. And what I love about history is you can often make it personal and relevant to yourself, like I was mentioning in the beginning. So I encourage you to look at history with that perspective in mind. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And thank you for joining me on this very special episode of Unboxing the Archives. Stay curious and keep learning, and I'll see you next time.